There's a common trope in fantasy, and sometimes also in science fiction, of a dialogue that takes place between the sage and the acolyte, between the master and the student. And for today's discussion, I want to examine a real-life version of such a dialogue and the implications that studying it has for writing better fantasy and science fiction. And the book that contains the dialogue in question is called Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. And this book has been around for decades in many different translations. But in this discussion, I'm going to be talking about one very specific translation, which was only done just very recently, for reasons that will soon become clear. Now, Rilke himself, he was an Austrian poet and a novelist. He lived from 1875 to 1926. His work and his personality were very heavily spiritual and mystical, and he had health problems throughout his life, and he died relatively young at the age of 51 of what later turned out to be leukemia. And the book itself is the record of a correspondence in letters between him and a young man named Franz Xaver Capus, who lived from 1883 to 1966, so he outlived the master by some decades. And this correspondence took place between Capus and Rilke over the course of about 6 years, from 1902 to 1908. Capus was at the time 19 years old. He was an officer cadet in military school, but he had ambitions about becoming a poet. And one of the professors who taught at that academy had taught Rilke himself years earlier. So Capus wrote to Rilke, originally looking for advice about his poetry. He was asking, is it any good? Should I try to be a poet? And Rilke wrote back, and not so much to talk about Capus's poems, but rather to talk about something more fundamental, about Capus's impulses to be an artist. And I'm going to quote here one excerpt at some length from the first letter to give you the flavor of what Rilke talks about throughout this book. And so he writes to Capus, "You ask whether your verses are any good. You ask me, you have asked others before this. You send them to magazines, you compare them with other poems, and you're upset when certain editors reject your work. Now, since you've said you want my advice, I beg you to stop doing that sort of thing. You are looking outside, and that is what you should most avoid right now. No one can advise or help you. No one. There is only one thing you should do. Go into yourself. Find out the reason that commands you to write. See whether it has spread its roots into the very depths of your heart. Confess to yourself whether you would have to die if you were forbidden to write. This most of all. Ask yourself in the most silent hour of your night, must I write? Dig into yourself for a deep answer. And if this answer rings out in assent, if you meet this solemn question with a strong, simple, I must, then build your life in accordance with this necessity. Your whole life, even into its humblest and most indifferent hour, must become a sign and witness to this impulse." And much of Rilke's advice in the book to the young man is about this kind of looking inward. And to that end, I think it stands in such tremendous and stark contrast to the advice that is given to people today about how to be creative. What Rilke is saying is, you don't create anything by trying to second guess what other people want, or look for, or even see in your work. You have to discover and perform only the work you can do, and no one else. You with your life, your experience, your outlook, and all the rest of it. Self-knowledge is essential for creation and for thriving as a creator. And you can see how advice like this resonated across many generations of creative people since the book's publication in 1929. Now, Capus's side of the conversation, all the letters that he wrote to Rilke, were believed lost for many decades. For the longest time, the only editions of the book that we ever had consisted of Rilke's replies. So this made some of Rilke's advice a little difficult to parse because you weren't sure what he was responding to. But recently, Capus's own letters were rediscovered. And so there's this new translation, which I would link in the description, and it includes both sides of the correspondence. And it includes some useful biographical information about both men, so there's even more context to draw on. Now, as I've hinted above with my little excerpt from it, this is one of the books I have that sits on my short shelf. It's this little shelf that is directly above the desk I'm sitting at now, where I keep the books that have proven their value to me over years and decades. And when I first read Letters to a Young Poet, it helped me connect with and amplify an understanding I've developed for some time now with regard to my science fiction and fantasy work and about my creative work generally. And all it is the understanding that you have to know what you really want. and not what you tell yourself you want. I've mentioned this before, it's always worth repeating, because to take this advice to heart is not easy. It is easier to look at what other people want and say, oh, I want that too. Or worse yet, to say, yeah, I bet I could do that. It's easier to do that instead of looking at what you want and saying, I want this, even though it's not popular, even though it's not easy to do. And this is really important when you're creating science fiction and fantasy for me, because the whole point of making those kinds of stories, of making those kinds of works, is to give the world singular and distinct visions of what could have been, or what might be. And the more we get of science fiction and fantasy that resembles other science fiction and fantasy, especially, anything that's been published in the last couple of years, the less it feels to me like we're living up to that mission. The more you can dig into yourself, the more you bring something of yourself that is totally yours to the table, instead of just what you've read or what you've seen, the better it's going to be. I have this word that I use a lot to talk about this aspect of science fiction and fantasy, and also creative work generally, and the word is individuated. You don't mistake someone with a really distinct voice and worldview for anybody else. You don't mistake an Ursula K. Le Guin for a Philip K. Dick. And you don't mistake either of them for Robert Heinlein. And you don't mistake either of them for Adrian Tchaikovsky, for that matter. You can pick up one of their books and read 5 lines or read 1 page, and you know it's them. So let me put this as a question. What kind of science fiction and fantasy do you want to see in the world that doesn't exist yet? What kinds of questions about ourselves, about yourself, do you not see being treated through a fantastic lens, and that you feel you must do justice to? Must being Rilke's word. You look for that kind of science fiction and fantasy to make where you can't help yourself but make it. And that's what drove me to create, that sense that there's this hole in the universe shaped like the story that I have in mind, and I need to go fill that hole. And reading Rilke's letters helped me sense more clearly how important having that feeling is and doing justice to it. There's another thing Rilke writes in this book where he says, a work of art is good when it is necessary, when it comes from a need. And he wasn't talking about just the need to fill space on a shelf. He was talking about filling spaces inside us. So look for that space inside you that needs filling with a creation, a fantastic creation. Start there. And if you make that, odds are other people will be curious about it too. Okay, now that I've talked about the inspirational aspect of this book, I want to also talk about 2 of the more functional aspects of how this volume can be useful in making stories, and science fiction and fantasy stories particularly. And the first is the same one that I mentioned before. It's the idea of the dialogue between the sage and the student. It's a common trope that we've seen in many different places and comes up a lot in fantasy, but also comes up in science fiction. And the dynamic between the 2 parties is really important. And in this book, it's especially about the way the relationship between the 2 men continued to evolve after the correspondence ended. And when you find out what that is, by the way, how things continue to evolve after they stopped writing to each other, it amounts to something of a spoiler. So if you read the edition that I've mentioned here, you're going to find out a lot more about the future arc of Capus as a creator and a human being, and how distinct that became from the younger and more confused man that you see in the letters. So that's a point of inspiration to take, to think about how things diverge and how things come together before and after the letters start going back and forth. That also leads me into the second angle that you can use in science fiction and fantasy, which is how this is a good example of what is called the epistolary mode. And that's the kind of thing where the story is told in the form of correspondence. A recent example of this would be something like, This Is How You Lose the Time War. One of my favorite earlier examples of this is Theodore Sturgeon's Some of Your Blood. And it's a really good unsung example, frankly. It's actually a lot closer to horror than science fiction, but I strongly recommend it. So the stories that we get in the letters themselves can be quite multifaceted. In this book, you have Capus's own story. You have Rilke's own story. You have the stories that each of them relate to each other about themselves, which are not always the full story. There's the larger story of the world around both of them at the time, and the larger story that exists before the correspondences begin and after they end. These are all dimensions worth thinking about if you're using an epistolary mode. How are the corresponders revealing themselves to each other? But also, how are they holding back or telling each other, or even just telling themselves only what needs to be known? And if you're doing that in a science fiction or fantasy setting, these give you ways to also talk about the world at large, how it's different from ours, or even how it's similar, and how the lens that you want to to look at the world through is going to be constituted. So once again, the book is Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. The specific edition that I've been referring to here is available both digitally and in print. And by the way, the print edition is quite nice. It's a turtleback edition. It's a hardback, but it's a small form factor. So it's the kind of thing that's great to throw into a knapsack and go take with you when you go out for a month in the country. But whatever form factor you encountered in, and I encourage you to have the encounter with this book, to think as much as you can about its implications for how and why you want to make things, especially if they are fantastic things, and see what you think from what that gives you.